Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. We were supposed to be off this week for the Memorial Day holiday, but some major news in the world of literature broke on Saturday, May 20th, when we learned of the death of Martin Amis, one of the great British writers of the last half-century. He burst onto the scene with the publication of The Rachel Papers in 1973 and published his last novel, Inside Story, in 2020. Of course, burst onto the scene is precisely the kind of cliche that Martin Amis would have loathed, and he would have called me out on it. Along the way, Amis earned many more plaudits as a critic and an essayist of the first order. I gathered Dwight Garner, longtime book critic at the New York Times, and Jason Zitterman, a critic at large who is also one of the hosts of the Amis podcast, The Martin Chronicles, to talk about the author's life, work, and legacy. Dwight, thank you for being here.
It's great to be here, Gilbert.
Jason, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Dwight, you wrote a magnificent obituary of Martin Amis for the Times. I would love you to distill that really sweeping piece of the man's entire life into a few minutes right here for our podcast listeners. Who was he?
It was a big life. Martin Amis was well known almost from birth in England, the literary scene, because his father was Kingsley Amis, the very well-known, the great comic masterpiece he wrote, Lucky Jim. It appeared in 1954. Kingsley Amis got older, got jolly, drank a lot, became a sort of well-known figure in London, sometimes a figure of fun as he got older. He was a Tory and right-wing political commentator, and yet always a very literary man. And Martin grew up under the sign of his father, went to Oxford, where he got a congratulatory first, which is a rare kind of, this is not in my obituary, but a very rare kind of honor to get when you graduate reading English, as he did, and went into the literary world scene in London, worked for the Times Literary Supplement and the New Statesman, and famously at the time, I think Christopher Hitchens, his great friend, has written that he's dated the glamorous, beautiful, young literary women who worked in these places, and the list of names is endless. And then he began writing novels. And he said that his first novel, The Rachel Papers, came out in 1973, which is a bit mind-blowing for me because he didn't appear on my radar. I mean, in 1973, I was 8. And he always seemed like more of a product of my own life. He's always been there anyway for me as a reader. But he said when he wrote that novel, he gave it 1 year, writing it on weekends. And if it hadn't panned out, he might have done something else with his life, which is amazing to consider because to get to the heart of this story, he became arguably the most slashing, articulate, devastatingly clear, pungent writer of the last 25 years of the past century and the first almost 25 of this century. When writers talk about Martin Amis, if you're in a room with writers, he is often the one that writers are envious of. Just his way with words, his descriptions, the fact that he just scorned cliche, scorned outdated language. In my own life as a writer, there are very few writers that, of course, I'm not a fiction writer, but I study writing, and there are only a handful of writers that I think of in the category that Martin Amis is in, which is if I'm stuck on a piece, so I've just written a bad sentence, but I think, would Martin Amis ever let this sentence go to print? And not that I can hope to match his sentences, but I hope not to sink to this level where don't do that, because Martin Amis wouldn't do it, and John Updike wouldn't do it, and a few other people wouldn't do it. And he's that kind of writer in many people's minds. He's the one. He's the one that people hope to live up to in many ways.
Jason, you co-host along with Parul Sehgal, the former book critic here at the Times, as well as the Slate writer and editor Dan Kois. The three of you co-host a podcast called The Martin Chronicles, which is going through his work book by book. How did you start with Martin Amis?
I was put on to Martin Amis from a girlfriend in college, and who was a big fan and a writer, and it completely blew my mind. One thing Dwight said that really resonates with me is that if you're a writer, you come to him in a different way. And when this podcast came about, I sort of lost touch with Martin Amis for a couple of decades. And when Dan asked me to do it, my first thought was, this is a great idea. He's one of these few figures who you could spend years on without getting bored. He has a huge stature. He has a complicated career, a messy legacy. But also, selfishly, the only way I know of to get better as a writer is to read better writers. And I really thought, if I systematically read Martin Amis, it will make my prose better. And I think it's true. I think it's a bad idea to try to imitate him, but he definitely inspires you, not just in what he executes, but what he attempts. The ambition of him, both on the sentence level, but also in terms of the subject he takes on. It's something that he gets mocked about, he gets criticized for. But I think one thing I get from reading all of these great pieces being written about him now is I really admire these huge swings he takes. And I'm not sure there's many people who do that to the extent that he did anymore.
In one of those Paris Review interviews that every major writer is made to do at some point, I'm sure very enthusiastically, Amos said the following: I would say that the writers I like and trust have at the base of their prose something called the English sentence. An awful lot of modern writing seems to me to be a depressed use of language. Once I called it a, quote, vow of poverty prose. Dwight, in your obit, you wrote that he was the most dazzling stylist in post-war British fiction. Talk to us about that style. What made it memorable? What made it pop?
Here's why a lot of people read. Here's why I read. Amos was just a great noticer of things in the world. If an Amos character walks into an airport, walks into a gas station, walks into a 7-Eleven, walks into a fish and chip shop, you know you're going to read impressions of all of these things in a way that probably no one's ever explained them before, at least not so sharply and so well. I've been in a room where people were talking about great sex writing, and someone ran to get, I forget which early novel now, but there's some descriptions. I'm not even going to try to describe what they're about, but they're so vivid that they're just outstandingly outrageous and just so great. You can't even believe it. He described John Updike once as kind of a NORAD sensibility, taking everything in from up above. And I think Amos was one of those same kind of characters. His favorite writers were Saul Bellow, Nabokov, and Updike. And all four of those writers, I think, belong in a certain kind of basket. Great noticers with an electric prose style. Wanted to, at the end of my review, I quote, or there was a line that Amos writes about a different writer in one of his novels, but he didn't want to please his writers. Amos says about them, he wanted to stretch them until they twanged. And that twang, that being stretched, is part of what Amos does in his best fiction.
Jason, I don't want to ask you too much about your early dating life, but you said you were introduced to the Rachel Papers by a girlfriend. What was your experience like reading it at the time? And I assume you've had to revisit it in order to embark on this project you're doing now.
Luckily, it was not the Rachel Papers, which I think is a bad
Oh, it wasn't the Rachel Papers.
No, it was not. It was Amos. It was London Fields, and Money. The Rachel Papers, I think, is a bad early dating book to read together.
Good point. Good point.
But I have read it recently, and it's fascinating. I think Amos, since then in Experience, his memoir, which in some ways I think might be his best book, says that when it comes to Rachel, when you're that young, autobiography is forced upon you. And so he's really writing about somebody who's very much like himself, and it's a young person's book. Reading it again is interesting. It's horrifying to read now that I have kids, as opposed to being around that age. But yeah, back then it was more, I think at the time, I didn't realize you could be this sort of highbrow prestige writer and be that entertaining, that titillating. What Amos says he's after, and then what he is, what he does. And there's what he wants to be and what he is. To me, while he cared about posterity and about being in this lineage of highbrow writing, and it's in his family, obviously, he's a terrific entertainer who's very generous to his audience. In his last book, he uses this metaphor of being a host. He's a very good host. He's considerate to his reader. He thinks about them. And although in some regards, he can be a difficult host sometimes, but he also has a generous view of the reader. And I think he's also really a generous public figure. It's amazing. He weighed in on, whether it's AIDS or the nuclear arms or Hitler or Stalin. His legacy, if anything, as a journalist is as great as his legacy as a fiction writer. He's a terrific critic, including for this publication. My favorite work of his is his criticism. And he's not a critic like you see one of these novelists or academic who writes their stuff. He is a critic who's got a respect for a newspaper hack. He writes incredible leads and kickers. In his early days, he was much more harsh. But in the 80s, he has this collection called the Moronic Inferno, which he has a genre which barely exists anymore, which I would call a hatchet job profile, which is a mix of criticism and a profile. He does all the things that a profile that writer does. He visits with the subject, he interviews them, he talks to the people around, he sets the scene, and he does all the things that a critic does in that he sums up their career, he analyzes language, he analyzes theme. But they're vicious. They're unbelievable. They're vicious to people's face.
Hang on a second. I love that book. I have not picked it up for probably 15 years. But I remember in that book, he follows Reagan on the campaign trail, I believe. He visits like Updike or Nabokov or Bellow. Who does he go and tear? I only ask this because I'm trying to imagine in my own mind visiting a writer and then going home and typing a piece that tears him apart.
This is what I'm saying. Right now you have reviews, which are sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Profiles, the range is between positive and maybe ambivalent occasionally. Go back and read him on Didion. Go back and read him on Spielberg. No one has ever shown Spielberg this amount of contempt. Amos could be fantastically wrong. At one point he says it's impossible to see a De Palma movie twice, which, is clear that I've seen Carrie 50 times or something. But he's very harsh, interestingly, on Roth in that book, and specifically about what success does to him.
This was around the time that Roth had a lot of critics, including Updike, and Roth put on those late career afterburners. But anyway, you're right.
Mailer is a figure who I would say in the Mailer essay, he integrates the interviews and with the criticism in a particularly brutal way. He uses the details of the interview to indict the art, which is something you rarely see in journalism today.
I need to go back to this book.
Which you don't see in the book that most people, the collection that people point to is The War on Cliché, which is great and has stuff from 40 years. But I think he cared more about who he was bothering at that point later in his career. And so he didn't include a lot of those pieces.
Dwight, he wrote 15 novels, which I want to dig into in a bit, but Jason brings up a wonderful point. In the latter part of his career, certainly he was as known and respected for his essays, his reviews, his criticism, something that you both know very well, as his novels. How did that kind of writing strike you?
The criticism?
Yes.
Life-changing. He was the best critic of his era, I believe. And one of those rare writers, whenever you saw his byline in any publication, you just couldn't wait. You would buy the magazine because back when there were magazines on newsstands, you would see that he had a piece. He was on the cover of Talk magazine or something. And of course, you would just pick that up. You felt that his criticism and his fiction weren't really at war with each other. I mean, he had the same voice in both, the same way of looking at the world. Good writers are often good critics because to bring back the idea of noticing and just being aware. He had a great sense of what made fiction work, what didn't make it work. And often his knowledge, the stuff he put into his criticism, you could feel playing out in his own books. I loved it when he wrote about writing. One of my favorite novels of his is The Information from 1995, which is about two warring writers, close friends, one of whom becomes successful, the other does not, and about the moral, social, intellectual agony that results in financial. And but he's just so funny. My favorite scene in the novel, we all remember back when newspapers like the New York Times they were like watermelons. They were 20 sections in them. They were just enormous. One of the writers, trying to get even with the other, drops the whole paper on his front step with a little Post-it note that says, "Lovely mention of you in here." And of course, there wasn't a lovely mention. There was no mention. And so the guy just spends 8 hours looking through every little, before the internet, of course, you can't find the guy. And just, Amos was funny. And so, his later work, he became less so. I think this happens to artists sometimes. They kind of feel that the funny ones sometimes tend to feel they're relegated to the kids' table, which I think is a dumb way to feel about things. Even Woody Allen said that about his own movies. As we all know, he got darker and more Bergman-esque over time, at least for a while. And Amos got more political. His friend Christopher Hitchens often was critical of Amos's attempts to write about serious political and historical issues. But I think that it's his great good humor and zest that's going to define his legacy.
Just add one thing. Information is also, maybe not surprisingly, my favorite Amos novel. It's a great satire of publishing. It's also a great satire of journalism. There's a little magazine which has some of the funniest attacks on book critics and theater critics that I've ever read. But he has one line which I love, which is, "Writers are nightmares from which you cannot awake. Most alive when alone. They make living hard to do for those around them."
Jason, you have been a longtime comedy critic for the New York Times. What strikes you about Amos's humor?
Dwight is absolutely right that first of all, he called his own work comedy, and he cared about posterity, by the way. I think James Wood compared him to Woodhouse, right? And some people might say that was that's the best comic writer you could come up with who has a legacy. I'm not sure I can think of a funnier writer. And I think I think it's an open question about how he'll age. And I know, as I said, I know some people who think that his journalism will age better than novels. I think he will be remembered not as a successor to Bellow. He'll be remembered as one of our great comic writers. And even I think you're absolutely right that he got less funny as he got older. But, I just reread House of Meetings, which takes place in a gulag, Stalin's gulag. And there's humor in there, too. It's a very bleak kind of humor, but it's laced throughout his work. And I often think that if Amos wasn't the child of Kingsley Amis, say he didn't have a famous father, and say he was a genre writer like Philip Dick or something, I think he would be the kind of writer who critics like 20 years from now or academics would champion and say, this is this incredible writer who we treated as a comic writer, but is actually much more than that. And he would clearly be assigned to schools and be considered one of the greatest. But because not only was he placed as Kingsley's son, but he saw himself as that. And you see that in the Rachel Papers right from the jump. The Rachel Papers is about somebody who is both obsessed with sex, but he's also obsessed with being seen as a literary person. Being seen, he sees himself, a 20-year-old in the same league as Shakespeare. And that is a interesting tension, I think, throughout his whole career. And I think he gets in this phase where he's writing about, he's preoccupied by Stalin or Hitler or nuclear weapons. He is less convincing. Another book that I think is underappreciated of his, which I like precisely because it's more of a genre work, is Einstein's Monsters, which is a collection of short stories, which I think he would probably say wasn't very ambitious. He was very interested in nuclear arms. He had a little very serious essay at the beginning, which his dad hated. And then he has 5 short stories that are very much genre fiction. There's one kind of horror story about a giant dog who's a monster who kills one person from this village every week. And this is this post-apocalyptic novel. And then the last one is like just a comic monologue from the perspective of one of the last people on Earth, which reads very much like Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. Mel Brooks is 2,000-Year-Old Man. And it's hilarious. It's hilarious. And it's a rare example of probably something he just tossed off, but I think it really works.
We'll be right back. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm here with Dwight Garner, critic at The Book Review, and Jason Zinnemann, longtime comedy critic at The Times and co-host of the podcast The Martin Chronicles. We are talking about the author Martin Amis, who died recently at the age of 73. Dwight, in addition to publishing your Amis obituary this week, you also wrote a review collecting a bunch of columns from the Times Literary Supplement. And in your review, you have this line: his NB, which was the back page column at the Times Literary Supplement, was not a gossip column, Campbell explains. He hoped never to see the words Martin and Amis in proximity, and he mostly lived up to that vow. I think you write that line because, at least when he was living in England before he moved to Brooklyn, Martin Amis was, for a time, as known for being a man about town, part of these sort of young British lights as he was for being an author. I love gossip. I think you love gossip. I would love you to situate who he was in that context in the early and mid-'80s.
Yeah, his career in a lot of ways was sort of a gift to literary society because writers now, it's like the rich. It's conspicuous consumption. People play it close to the vest a lot of times. And writers these days, more and more, don't want to have their opinions floating around. It's easier to get picked off in a variety of ways. Amis sort of lived in public to a large degree. First of all, he was extremely handsome, really great to look at. Women threw themselves at him from the start. You could imagine him being the lead singer in Oasis. He was that good looking, And he smoked and he drank and he partied and he had these famous lunches in London with other literary lights. And he stayed out late. He looked cool with a cigarette. He would just seem to live and have more fun than most people. And writers envied that. And so at least once every 2 years, some blazing young critic would come crashing into Martin Amis and explode. Martin Amis would survive. Their careers often did not. But as he aged, he got married, he had children, but he always was willing to give interviews. And in these interviews, he was sort of unbuttoned in a way that no writer was, I would say, since Mailer probably. He was just willing to get out there and wrestle with public ideas. He was a public intellectual, and it was a gift. There's no one like that quite now, and I miss it. Someone said, I think it was the critic James Walcott, when Martin Amis had a new novel out late in his career, what you waited for were the interviews, because they were more fun than the novel, usually. So Amis was lucky in the sense that people used to say about Ted Hughes, the poet, that he was lucky in his career to look like a poet. He just did. And the fact that he could write, he wouldn't have made it otherwise. But Martin Amis just looked like a snotty, young, mean novelist, which he was. We haven't really talked about how cruel he could be. And his books are kind of vicious in their observations. I think if you heard that he was reviewing you, you'd feel like you had the Red Baron on your tail. It'd be like finding that Ronan Farrow was writing about you in the New Yorker or something. If you had those sort of problems in your life. But anyhow, I miss his glamour. He was glamorous. He was funny. He was witty. He was shrewd. I just miss a lot of things about him.
He also was part of this class of writers that in 1983 was named by Granta magazine as the best of young British novelists. It's a list they do every 10 years. They just released it's like the Sight and Sound list. They just released another one a couple of months ago, and it was him, and it was Ian McEwan, and Julian Barnes, and Salman Rushdie, and Ishiguro. You Dwight wrote a review of a book called Circus of Dreams. Was that last year? It was a book that
a
last
year or two ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was about this sort of 80s literary world. I'm also curious about he and the people around him, other than him being this rock star author. What was the thing that tied this group of still very famous British novelists together, if anything? How did he fit into that group?
Well, they kind of broke through in a way. There was a kind of British fiction that was more domestic and hidebound. In the 60s and 70s, a lot of terrific novelists, but more domestic in their fiction, a little bit more staid, a little bit more careful. And these young voices were just Julian Barnes and Amos, especially, Ishiguro, certainly. Clive James, the critic, is an important one to mention. He was just an electric critic. Hitchens, of course, who never wrote fiction, but was a very literary person. And all of them were just a new breed. It was like Hollywood in the 60s. London in the 80s was like Hollywood in the 60s. This whole new generation rushed in. And they weren't just talented. They were like attractive and they were flamboyant and they sort of burned the candle at both ends. And they were here to be alive. There's some great quote, I think it's from Ian Drury, the rock star. I'm not here to be remembered. I'm here to be alive. And you kind of felt that about them, even though, of course, they all have one eye on posterity. But you felt them just burning out in real time. And it was very attractive and very real.
His biggest scandal, which now Dwight could probably help me with the details of this, but it seems very mysterious, was in the mid-90s. And it's when he fired, it also represented a split in this group because he fired his agent and hired Andrew Wiley. And his agent was the wife of Julian Barnes, and who also, I believe, was his dad's agent. And he signed for some preposterous amount of money. I forgot exactly what it was.
It was something so absurd at the time, certainly to the authors around him, that I think it was A.S. Byatt who went public to say, my books sell more than Martin Amos's books. What the heck is he doing asking for an advance like this?
And it was a big story that he used some of the money, or so it was reported, to fix his teeth, which also plays into, first of all, it's an obsession of his throughout all his fiction, teeth. There's a lot of teeth, including his nonfiction. He writes about Stalin's teeth, Hitler's teeth, and he said the one thing he shares with Nabokov is bad teeth. And of course, this also plays into a peculiarly British anxiety. I mean, I think that's another difference, is that in this group, that Amos loved America and he was fascinated by America. He also he could be a little snotty about America, but his idea of America from early was that success was bigger in America. He said that if you had a lot of success as a British writer, maybe you'd go out and buy a few file cabinets. But in America, everything is much more glamorous. This scandal in the mid-90s, which seems strange to me. Like, why would being a successful author and getting a lot of money and getting your teeth fixed earn this much criticism, seem to upset the British press in a way that, this might be too much, but years later he would leave and come to Brooklyn. But I don't know, could you explain why this was such a big deal in the mid-90s?
It's a very British thing, isn't it? I think it's largely because of this sort of Nepo baby thing. Everyone knew who Kingsley Amis was, and here comes his devastatingly good-looking son who suddenly has money thrown at him, and it seemed, I think, to a lot of people unfair and unwarranted. But it turns out it was warranted. He was worth everything they threw at him. It was a weird moment in time. You just felt that almost every day there was some Amos story in the paper. And gods of literary gossip, give us a bit more of that, will you? I mean, we don't need a lot more of it. But I look back on that generation; they're much more open. There were books of photographs, for example, that people took of writers in the 80s and the 70s. And who is the photographer that is chronicling the lives of young writers now? Where are these people? Anyway, we're all curious about writers' life to some degree. And I'm not talking about unwarranted intrusions, but you just felt that writers swam among us in a way then that they don't quite now.
Dwight, I'm going to ask you both, but I'll start with Dwight, just to talk to our readers, many of whom have probably read a ton of Amos, but where would you start, or what do you think are the ones that tower above the rest? You talked about his London trilogy of novels, but...
Yeah, probably Money, I think, is a good one to start with. It's probably my favorite. That and The Information are probably my favorite. A young, sort of bitter, loutish ad man from London comes to the United States to make a film. But what it's really about is just this sort of ugly man's impressions of the entire world. Amos could fill a mind like that like nobody's business, and yet make the whole thing feel that you weren't wasting your time on just negative things and reading the work of a loser. You really felt the whole world pouring through his vision. And we've talked about The Information, which gives Amos the chance, in the same way that the Henry Beck books gave Updike the chance. Updike famously said, who wants to read another book about a writer? And he's got a point. every novelist has all these feelings about being a writer. And in the information, Amos could let fly in all these things, the tours, the journalism, every aspect of it. And you felt that he had so much to say about that it's just continually fascinating.
Jason?
Yeah, I think you start with the three, with London Fields, money, and the information. As I said, I think the journalism is essential, and I would go for Moronic Inferno first. I think in the Rachel papers, he describes his protagonist as being, his vocabulary is more refined than his emotions. And, one of the criticisms of him, he's he's limited emotionally in these books. And I think one great counter argument is in Experience, his memoir, which is a beautiful book. And it has all the hallmarks of his fiction, including down to things like inclusions of letters, which pop up over and over again, and close readings of language. But it's also a lovely portrait of his relationship with his father and an unflinching portrait of who he was as a young person. And I think that book, in a lot of ways, is his most moving book. And strangely, is not a bad place to start for someone who's new to him.
I agree with that. I think, actually, I wish I'd said that as well, because it's true. I think if you don't really want to dive into the deep end right away with Amos, I think the memoir might be a terrific place to start.
Dwight, as a Uber expert here, I have to ask you for one dark horse.
The dark horse. I kind of like Night Train, which is this weird crime detective thing he wrote. And it's got this insinuating thing about it. It's really readable.
Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you for asking me.
Dwight, thank you.
Thanks, Gilbert.
That was my conversation about the life and work of Martin Amis. I hope you've been inspired to read a new book of his or revisit an old one. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.